Hello and welcome, everyone. The Castro and we are DM25, a radical political movement for Europe. And this is another live discussion with our coordinating team featuring subversive ideas you won't hear anywhere else. Today, we have incredible news to celebrate. Julian Assange has been released, as announced early this morning by Wikileaks. Julian Assange, the founder of Wikileaks and a founding member of DM25, has long been a beacon for press freedom and the relentless pursuit of truth. DM25 has always stood by Julian, advocating tirelessly for his freedom and supporting his courageous fight against injustice. His release is not just a personal victory, but a win for our collective mission for real transparency and democracy. For years, Julian Assange has faced relentless persecution for exposing truths that our government sought to keep hidden, crimes committed by our governments behind our back in our name. While the perpetrators got away scot-free, Julian paid the price for allowing us to finally see what our governments desperately wanted to hide. His ordeal has been a stark reminder of the fragility of press freedom and the lengths to which those in power will go to suppress dissent and transparency. DM25 has always staunchly defended Julian by organizing rallies, campaigns, exhibitions, and mobilizing our members across Europe and beyond to stand in solidarity with him. In this live stream, we'll delve into the far-reaching implications of his release. We'll explore the ongoing battle for justice, the critical importance of press freedom, and our continuous struggle to liberate all political prisoners worldwide. Because the fight for justice is far from over. There are still many political prisoners around the world who need our voice and our support. We must continue to advocate for the rights of whistleblowers, journalists, and activists everywhere. Because first, they came for Assange, and then they came for Chelsea Manning, Edward Snowden, and so many more. Joining us tonight are our very own Yanis Varoufakis, Srećko Horvat, Karin, Rigo, and the rest of our dedicated team. They will share their views on this historic moment and what this means for the rest of us. I encourage you to participate in this discussion via the YouTube chat. Your support and engagement are more crucial than ever as we continue our fight for a world where justice and truth prevail. And now to kick us off, let's hear from Yanis Varoufakis. Yanis, over to you.
In these dark times, it's magnificent to have a few rays of light to pierce through the darkness and to allow us to celebrate that the human spirit cannot be confined into the darkness forever, that the human spirit cannot be defeated, that resistance is never futile, even when it seems to be so. There were times when, with Srećko Horvat and with others of you here, we felt that the struggle to save Julian was probably lost. There were bleak moments. There were stony years, especially after 2015, 2016. I'll get back to this in a moment, but let me first, because there are quite a few people who don't understand what exactly has been going on. As most people know, at this very moment, Julian is on an airplane. It is disgraceful that he has to pay for it himself, that it is a chartered private flight that the Australian government, the British government, the American government, who have caused all this pain, are not paying for. So remember, we need crowdfunding to help pay for the $500,000 necessary to take Julian to Guam, to somewhere in the middle of nowhere in the Pacific. Let me act as a pseudo-journalist for one moment for the benefit of those viewers and listeners who do not know exactly what has been going on. Look, it was around 9 months ago when Julian's family informed me that there was an offer by the American government of a plea deal. It sounded simultaneously like good news and bad. The plea deal was you come to the United States, you agree to drop your resistance to the extradition process in the United Kingdom, you come to the United States, you appear in front of a court as a prisoner of the United States government, you declare yourself to be guilty of a lesser charge, espionage charge, but not the top notch, which would qualify for him for the death penalty of 1,000 years in prison or whatever. You will be sentenced to 5 years in prison, and then because you've already spent 5 years in Belmarsh, this will be considered time served, and then you will be released and you will be extradited to Australia. That was months ago that it was proposed to him. I can tell you that he said no, because he's not guilty of anything. And also because of the fear that once you end up in the jurisdiction of Virginia, where the process started 12 years ago of persecuting him and making sure that he dies in a supermax prison, as if he was going to go there. So there have been two parallel processes. One is his family has been pushing Julian to accept, because this is a family that has been completely wrecked by all those years of having Julian dying slowly inside that prison. And I understand that entirely. And at the same time, there was negotiations on how to ensure that he does not spend 1 hour in prison, and especially not a supermax prison, not in any cell, even of the judicial system, of the court system in the state of Virginia, in the District of Columbia. So in the end, it's clear now that I learned from the media myself. I didn't have any inside information, that the deal was completed. They found the nearest American judicial jurisdiction, which is as near to the territory of the Australian Commonwealth, which is somewhere in a godforsaken little island near Guam. And he's being flown there on the understanding that he will not be incarcerated, not for 1 hour. He will appear in front of a judge. The fact, however, remains, and this is crucial, that he will have to appear in front of a judge with his lawyer. The prosecutor will be there. The judge will address the prosecutor and ask if a plea deal has been made. The prosecutor will say yes. Then Julian will be instructed by the judge to express in his own words his guilt. So he's not just going to plead guilty, he will have to explain why he's guilty and not contest his guilt. And then it will be up to the judge, at least formally, to accept this elocution, as it's called, the expression of remorse and guilt by Julian. I'm explaining this in sordid details so that we know exactly what is happening and to understand why, while it is a major victory for Julian Assange and for all of us who have been tirelessly working towards his release, because the United States government has been shamed into giving up the task of killing him. The United Kingdom has completely been humiliated by this. Because remember, the United Kingdom was saying for 12 years now that there's nothing they can do. That since an extradition has been asked for, first by Sweden, remember Srećko, and then by the United States, well, their hands have been tied. Bullshit. How can I prove that? It's really very simple. You know, they let him fly out of Britain without the extradition process having been rescinded. So it is clear that they were not obliged to respect the extradition process, either the Swedish one or the American one, because clearly today they let him leave the country without the extradition process being formally suspended. So the United Kingdom, as an entity, as a state, should be hanging its collective head in shame today, as should the Biden administration and Trump administration. But nevertheless, while we have every reason to celebrate, because it just goes to show that the pressure from the movement has borne fruit. And that is a great moment for us, for the movement, for Julian, for everybody who has been fighting against all odds, the powers that be, the totalitarianism that be. It's a great day for us, for the movement, but it is a major defeat for journalism. The editors of the New York Times, the Washington Post, the Guardian, Der Spiegel, Le Monde should also be hanging their heads in shame because they have been defeated. The fact that Julian, in order to survive and to be reunited with his family and his friends, the fact that he needs to tomorrow stand in front of a judge and accept the jurisdiction of the United States outside the borders of the United States accept the right of the United States government to imprison somebody for 5 years, remember, time spent 5 years, for a crime committed outside the United States by a non-US citizen. And what crime? The crime of telling the truth as a journalist. You know what this means? It means that the legacy of Dan Ellsberg, the hero, our hero, of the Pentagon Papers, who published damning information right from within the Pentagon about the Vietnam War, and who stood his ground, in the end, he never acquired a criminal record. He was never convicted of anything. So journalism survived the persecution of Dan Ellsberg. By the way, Dan Ellsberg was a great supporter, until he died very recently, of Julian Assange. But Julian Assange is now going to have a criminal record, which of course is a badge of honor for him. But it is a badge of disgrace for the New York Times, for the Washington Post, for the Guardian, who did nothing to defend him during the difficult dark ages where Srećko and I and all of you were fighting for his freedom. And they were condemning him as a rapist, as a supporter of Donald Trump, and all that jazz. Allow me to say a few words now about that dark age, that dark period. And Srećko will add to that, I'm sure. There was a time when we would be in the Ecuadorian embassy and for hours and hours and hours be discussing with Julian the avalanche of mud that was being thrown and piled upon him. And, you know, the powers that be, the totalitarian states, United States, United Kingdom, and so on, they were very smart about the way they did it. Because what they did was this. They tried to find the weak link. They tried to find, you see, if you accuse me of being a communist, I don't mind. You're probably right. If you accuse me of being anti-NATO, anti-US government, I'll say, yes, that's exactly right. If you accuse me of being a rapist, if you accuse me of being anti-Semite, an anti-Semite, which is what, of course, happens all the time, that really hurts. Because as feminists, as anti-racists, the mere mention of these accusations is a major, major, major wound. It's a trauma. And that's what they did. You will recall, some of you who were with us with DiEM25 back then, that especially immediately after Jeremy Corbyn became the leader of the Labour Party, at a time when, of course, Julian was still being persecuted and prosecuted, and he was in the Ecuadorian embassy. And that time was when, of course, that incredible case by Sweden, supposedly on rape charges, which never were laid, never. It was just mud. It was just innuendo. There was never a charge, even for sexual assault, for rape, or anything like that. It was just innuendo, the kind of mud that sticks, and there's nothing you can do to wash it because you can't even address a charge that has been laid down against you. But I remember, and Srećko will confirm that in his own words, I remember how desperate those days were when we were losing all our comrades. Remember, DiEM25 had an agreement to merge our efforts with a very valiant, progressive, youthful movement in Britain called Another Europe is Possible. Do you remember that? And do you remember why that alliance, that merger, was at the very last moment jettisoned and blown up? Because they demanded that we ditch Julian Assange because he was a rapist. We lost young feminists, women and men, across the United Kingdom and across Europe. Within our own movement, do you remember that, Srećko? We had people within our movement, even in the SCC, in the coordinating collective, saying, come on, let's ditch Julian. He costs us more than he benefits us. But we stood our ground and we said no. And we had even had an all-member vote in order to defeat that attempt for DiEM25 to be co-opted by the, effectively, the successful wave of vilifying Julian, which took root within the progressive movement in Northern Europe, not so much Southern Europe, but in Northern Europe. Do you remember that in November 2018, Bernie Sanders, myself, David Adler, and others were in Vermont, and we started the Progressive International? Well, let me be very clear on this. After we started the Progressive International, Bernie Sanders and I proclaimed and the PI and came out and said, join us to the world. We had a message from Bernie's senatorial team saying, but the condition is you drop Julian because he's too hot a brick or a potato for us to handle. And very soon after that, one of our comrades, a wonderful woman, who was part of the Progressive International, the Prime Minister of Iceland, Jakob's daughter, signaled to us that as long as we support Julian, a rapist, in inverted commas, she cannot be part of the Progressive International. I'm saying that because, you know, now everybody can be pro-Julian, everybody can pretend that they were part of this movement, even the Labour Party under my very, very dear friend and comrade, Jeremy Corbyn. They would not pick up the phone when I called them to seek the support of the Labour Party under Jeremy Corbyn for Julian. I'm saying this because our memory is necessary to be preserved as a bulwark against what will happen next to other comrades, to other freedom fighters like Julian Assange. And when I say other, I mean other. The Australian Prime Minister is presenting himself as a good guy who's helped. No, he hasn't. No, he hasn't at all. The only reason why Biden has relented was because he's losing the youth vote as a result of his support of genocide in Gaza. And he wants to make some relatively costless gesture to the, you know, Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez, Bernie Sanders supporters who voted for him in 2020 and who are probably not going to vote for him now, a costless gesture. That is what it is for him. It's great that we managed to push him in that direction. But, you know, Mr. Albanese, the Australian Prime Minister, in my books, you are guilty. You could have said a year and a half ago to President Biden that if America wants Australia to spend $360 billion on American submarines, the first thing they need to do is drop the charges, not condemn him and take him to the Guam base now. And speaking of Australia, given that we have managed to work towards the freedom of Julian, what about David McBride? David McBride is another whistleblower who is now inside a high security prison in Australia. Why? Because he revealed, just like Wikileaks had revealed, David McBride was the person who exposed the Australian massacre of Afghanis, the Australian soldiers' massacre of Afghanis, a massacre which was revealed, exposed. There was a royal commission. It found the Australian military guilty of a massacre in Afghanistan because David McBride did expose them. None of them ended up in prison. David McBride is in prison in Australia. So, Mr. Albanese, I look at you in the face and I say, shame on you. You have had nothing to do with the remarkable developments in releasing our friend and comrade Julian Assange. We need to carry on with along the lines of this spirit of solidarity to David McBride, to Boris Karalitsky, a socialist activist who is being held as a political prisoner in Moscow by Putin's regime. DiEM25 must show that we're here for the long term, and Julian, who was with us from the very, very beginning, is simply an inspiration that we are going to take to the Modi fascist regime in India. They're even thinking of imprisoning Arundhati Roy as we speak. This is just the beginning of the struggle. It is not the end of the struggle. It's the end of the beginning of the struggle. So let's hail Julian's success, our success in supporting Julian, and let's mourn together the manner in which European and American journalism has been condemned, or will be condemned tomorrow, by that kangaroo court in Guam or somewhere in the Pacific, because that will be an indictment on the freedom of journalism across the world. We will celebrate, we will take the moment to maybe even have a glass of champagne to celebrate Julian's freedom as a reminder of the essence of what we are all about as DiEM25, as the Progressive International. We have not allowed even comrades to bend our will and force us to betray Julian. We will not allow them to bend our will and force us to end the defense of other political prisoners and, of course, the whole of Palestine. Carpe diem.
Thank you, Yanis, for those powerful words. I think one thing I just wanted to add before I pass over the word to Srećko is that for us, this isn't a political game of deciding what's palatable to talk about and what isn't, right? It's I think what's important is to stand up on the point of principle against all forms of injustice, no matter the political cost. And I think that's pretty much what you've outlined there as well. And look, just another comment. I think the reason why so many people distrust the political system and the political process is precisely because a lot of partisan leaders undermining by playing that kind of game, therefore fueling the far right and so on and so forth. Just a quick comment from the chat before Srećko comes on, from Julie Hamilton, who's actually a volunteer with us. Hi, Julie. Hope you're watching still. Julie says, Julian, you are loved and supported by millions of people. The fact that you're a founder of DiEM is one of the main reasons why I joined. Thank you all for what you've sacrificed. Wishing you good times. And also a comment from Sherry. Thank you to everyone who has supported Julian Assange's release. Over to you, Srećko. It's good to have you back.
Yeah, I'm really glad to be back, especially on this occasion, which, as Yanis said, on the one hand is definitely a reason for celebration, but at the same time, into which I will also go in my talk, it is also a reason for worrying, but also for reflecting and for strategizing further. This message which you, Davide, just read from the chat, I think perfectly speaks also about something which Yanis was mentioning. At the time when Yanis and me invited Julian to become one of the founding members of DiEM25, we have sent him the manifest. He was discussing it with us at the Ecuadorian embassy. He even joined the first DiEM event at Volksbühne, some other events and so on. This was a time, and we must remember it, when almost no other movement or even organization wanted to come anywhere close to Julian, and including so-called progressive activists, progressive parties, and so on. And we have lost many possible collaborators, even possible friends, and so on, because of Julian. And since then, but also from today's perspective, we never felt sorry for that. But I think we should definitely remember what also mainstream newspapers have done, from the New York Times to the Guardian, who have been fabricating news that Assange was meeting Manafort at the embassy, that he was a Russian spy, who were basically creating the character assassination, and then, of course, the sex allegations and so on, creating all sorts of aspects of a character assassination which would completely remove him from public life, and which would bring to the point where he would lose all support. What this day today has shown is that activism makes sense. And I say this after the European elections, with the results we all know. I say this at a moment when the left, mainly in Europe, in Latin America, is going a bit better, when the left generally, globally, is at a very bad state, when it's divided, when it's impotent to a certain degree. I think it's important this day because it shows that activism works, that millions of known and unknown activists, from known activists like Brian Eno, MIA, and many others, to many unknown activists who were, doing protests from Vienna to London, from other cities all across the world. I think it shows that this kind of belief those people had, and those kind of persistence, and this kind of dedication of their own life towards a principle which at the beginning and during all these years, maybe to some looked like a lost cause, I think this gives hope. And I'm not someone who actually believes in hope, but today I'm really hopeful because of this. And I remember once at the embassy, Julian was telling me that the only way he can be free is to create a sort of Nelson Mandela campaign, that the only way is this kind of planetary campaign, which would have to last for years. And in the case of Julian, it didn't last more than 20 years, like in the case of Nelson Mandela. But let's not forget, he wasn't just 5 years in prison. He was altogether more than 14 years in one way or the other way in some sort of arbitrary detention. And for what? It all goes back to 2007. It is the time before the smartphones, at least the smartphones we know today, when everyone could record something. And at that time, it was really a precedent. It was really something new and something very courageous to publish the video recordings which he received from Chelsea Manning, which showed that 2 Reuters journalists and civilians in Iraq were being killed by the US government. Nowadays, unfortunately, we face another problem. Instead of not knowing what our governments do, today they do it in broad daylight. Today, we witness live stream genocide. So the situation, in a way, is different, but I would say that WikiLeaks opened the door for revealing war crimes of various governments, and it's still so important. So to come back to what Yanis said, I also think besides the celebration, it's also a moment to stop. It's a moment to realize this will have grave consequences on journalism. Why? Because Julian has to plead guilty for a crime he didn't commit. And if he pleads guilty for a crime he didn't commit, then everyone who is a journalist could face the same destiny as Julian. And there is also one irony. I mean, it's not an irony, but it again shows this kind of cynicism of those in power. At the beginning, the US government was doing everything in order to show that he's not a journalist, that he's a hacker and I don't know what, cyber terrorist. I mean, you can watch these videos on the internet from Hillary Clinton to Joe Biden, what they say about Julian. Nowadays, as it appears, because that's the reason why he's flying to the middle of the Pacific, he suddenly became a journalist from the perspective of the US government. So as it suits them. I also think it's important to mention that he's flying to a place which is precisely a place which is the most heavily nuked place in our known universe. So after the Second World War, which finished with Hiroshima and Nagasaki, as we know, the Cold War started by nuclear tests precisely in the Marshall Islands and in the Pacific region where Julian is now going. And I find it symbolically very interesting because everything Julian was fighting against was precisely the military-industrial complex, including Silicon Valley, including Google, including a very deep understanding of technology. And where he has to plead guilty is precisely a place which is, I think, the worst symbol of US imperial power and also nuclear tests. But that said, I hope tomorrow he will be on his way to Australia. He will reunite with his family, with his sons, 2 sons, who are now already going to kindergarten, maybe even to school, who have never seen their dad outside of prison. So they never saw their dad free. And I think for that reason, we should really celebrate once he's on Australian soil. But I think we should also, not just SDM, but also other movements who joined and who created already a sort of informal network across the world, strategize what are the next steps. How to, not just how to invent some sort of damage control for the grave consequences of journalism, but how to turn this energy of this movement, which obviously exists and which is all obviously getting much stronger, into something which could in the future prevent these cases. So that said, I'm really glad. I just think that, yeah, at the same time, as Yanis already said, and many others will mention as well, we have to be careful. We have to watch where the plane is going and once it will appear in Australia. And I wish the best to Julian. If he is watching that, he can count, you can count on a drink with us. And we hope to see you very soon. Yeah.
Thank you, Srećko, for that reminder. And indeed, we should obviously celebrate for Julian and his family. We're very happy that and hopefully they'll be reunited very, very soon. But regarding the broader struggle and fight, it's indeed true that we need to, the fight isn't over. We need to continue to take that energy from the movement as a whole and direct it into other, other causes and the continuation of press freedom, the real democracy, transparency, and so on. Now we'll go over to Ivana. Ivana.
Thanks, David. Indeed, it's a day for us to celebrate because we've been on this journey with Julian from the beginning of Diem, some of you personally, even before that. And to prove that, I have Facebook memories coming up these days to remind me that 7 years ago, a local collective in Belgrade organized a protest in favor of freedom of journalism and freedom of Assange. Of course, that we were a tiny collective, but, and this is maybe an idea for others, organized the protest on a strategic, very busy little square in the city. So it appeared that it was many more people than we actually had. But that said, the fight is not done, as everybody before said. It's in our core, in our DNA, to advocate for transparency, for the freedom of speech, and for protection of whistleblowers. It's ironic that in these times when we are living and we are watching war crimes live, thanks to those smartphones that Srećko mentioned, Julian has to admit something that he hasn't done. And that's the price of his freedom. Unfortunately, I think that even taking him to that place in Pacific and everything else is just building on breaking his spirit and humiliating him in a way, because now that they had to let him go because it works for them. I mean, there's no other reason, I guess. This is where we are. So yes, celebrate Julian's freedom for sure, but continue our struggle for the freedom of press and the transparency as of tomorrow.
Thank you, Ivana, for those very important words. Just a couple more questions, comments from the chat. We have Lady Alex. It is not over yet. The oppressors still continue to oppress. Oh, yes, they do. Thomas Martin, I hope this turns out as planned and it is not a trick by the US to get hold of Julian. All right, we'll go over to Amir. Amir, over to you.
Thank you, David. I'm also anxiously watching the flight tracker to see how if the aeroplane is making any sudden changes in altitude or anything. Hopefully not, and it has a safe landing. I'm sure millions out there are praying for that. Just a short intervention from me for tonight is Srećko also mentioned the European elections briefly, but in general, given the moment today, we have to remember that we are where we are, and we got what we got because we had a lot of perseverance. And it's been more than a decade of struggle to free Julian, 14 years that he's been in some sort of incarceration or prohibition on his freedom of movement. The African National Congress was founded in 1912, and you might sort of use it as a proxy of 8 decades of liberating South Africa from colonialism and apartheid. It took the Algerian freedom fighters over 130 years to rid themselves from the shackles of French colonialism, and of course the ongoing struggle to free Palestine from the river to the sea. So I'm just mentioning this because we as the people, as the public, as the 99%, you might say, have been struggling against eons of culminated domination by the powerful. And so this is, historically, we have to bear that in mind, but in a sense, on a positive note, realize that historically we're living in one of the best moments ever, given our tools and levels of interconnectionness and history before us, that we can really organize ourselves really well and hand over a stronger baton to the next generation, not forgetting that, because there is a struggle again coming for the next generation and the future generations. Just a reminder that we are in the long haul on this.
Thank you, Amir. In the long haul we are. The fight does not stop. Judith, over to you now.
Thank you, David. I think that we must not forget that actually, no matter whether Julian is forced to plead guilty now or not, there has already been a chilling effect on journalism worldwide, which can be seen now, for example, with the war in Gaza. There are now two opinions in German media, for example. Just a few days ago, Save the Children reported that more than 20,000 Gazan children are currently missing or killed or under rubble. And it wasn't reported in any mainstream media. The same goes for many of the news that we only know through social media. So there has definitely been a chilling effect on the media that we may not have had without this very obvious persecution of someone who was just saying what needed to be said, what was the truth. And it shows the importance of free and independent media that is not beholden to any particular state, but just reports everything, every truth that is out there. And I believe the other lesson that we really ought to learn from the case of Julian is that we must not get distracted if our heroes appear to be less than pure. So what if he had actually met Manafort at the embassy, like that smear that they invented? What if he was still a journalist? What he did many years before their meeting was not in any way diminished by that. And I think that we are currently in an era where we forget this too easily. Like a lot of supporters or would-be supporters of Palestine are distracted by claims that this or that Palestinian is not entirely against armed struggle, not entirely against killing people that might not need to be killed. I don't know. They may have voted Hamas in the last election 15 years ago, and then suddenly we accept that as a reason for what should be unacceptable in any case. Press freedom is press freedom. Civilians are civilians. Children are children. How can any smear that they invent, even if it was true, how can that distract us from these basic universal human rights and universal values? And that is something that I think we need to watch out a lot more, because they're going to keep inventing stories to make us doubt our heroes. And we need to focus on what is essential. So today we celebrate with Julian, but tomorrow we need to watch out for the next whistleblower and for the next attempts to distract from what is really important.
Thank you, Judith. Indeed, when it concerns the media, I just want to point out that for those of you watching out there, if you haven't read or watched Noam Chomsky's documentary Manufacturing Consent in the book, I definitely urge you to do that because it really explains in a very detailed way how sometimes the media operates in a way to try to undermine certain narratives, right? Of the good guys versus the bad guys, good intentions versus bad intentions, worthy victims versus unworthy victims, and so on and so forth. So yeah, Manufacturing Consent, if you haven't read it, do go and read it. Now we'll go over to Karin. Karin, who's in Germany.
Thank you, Davide. So first of all, yeah, I would like to join the celebration on Assange, and I wish him all the best together with his family back. It must be really great to be able to do that finally after 13 years of prosecution, basically, not only in prison, but also in the embassy. And he had to face these high security prisons that, let me say, very clearly, not even the mafia bosses in Italy under the 41 bis have ever experimented. So, and he did that for denouncing crimes for which the criminals are still free. Let's not forget that, because he had to pay for them as well. And though we are super happy for him, we must not forget that this job, being a journalist now and sticking to the truth, costs lives. Because according to Reporters Without Borders, for example, only in 2023, 99 journalists were killed, most of them after the 7th of October. And for 2024, 21 were already killed and more than 500 imprisoned. So we see how the institutions mainly target very clearly and very brutally activists and journalists. Let me remind for 1 second the Palestinian journalist Shirin Abu al-Akleh, Anna Politkovskaya, Daphne Caruana. All these people paid with their lives because they were being really heroes. And they needed to face not only disinformation, not only smearing campaigns. I mean, governments and companies, they do not want really independent press. Let's be clear, they don't want people call out their crimes. So it's becoming increasingly dangerous, this job. So we need to support everybody who is doing that freely. And talking about Germany, because obviously the situation has changed dramatically in the last month. We have, according to the Press Freedom Index, in 2024, Germany is at the 10th place, but I can really be sure to say that next year is not going to be like that, because in the last 7 months, the attacks and the smearing campaigns against freedom of speech, against activists, protesters, every person criticized in Israel has been so strong and so blatant that international journalists from other TVs have always been very critical and very surprised even to see something like this in a supposedly democratic country. So I think every country has an Achilles heel, like a topic that really touches the nerves, the painful nerves. And for Germany is exactly this relationship to Israel and the Palestinian cause. But until now, we didn't know how really free we were, basically, because we saw just now, apart from the usual critics about Baerbock or Scholz, and obviously this is not really discussions about democracy, this is a discussion about incompetence. But when you really touch the main points, the sole reasons for which the freedom of expression can be sacrificed at once, then you know that you are not free. And we really need independent media, desperately, also in Germany, everywhere in the world, independent journalists that are really focused on telling the truth, because only in that way we can really save democracy and we can be really free in the end and participate like that to the liberation of everybody else. Thank you.
Thank you, Karin. Indeed, let's all support independent media where they exist. Absolutely. Danai, over to you.
Well, to join all the voices before me that said how happy we all are for Julian as a person on a human scale, this is an extremely important thing. And then just a few thoughts that maybe will add a little more insight in what we have said. Of course, perseverance is the word that best characterizes why this happened, for sure, for so many years of people like us, of movements like us, activists around the world, people that their voice has could be heard. But I wanted to highlight also that Stella was an extremely important person, because she basically dedicated her all these years really not letting one day pass without fighting this. And this gave it a personal touch. This dedication was very, very touching, I believe, and emotional, additionally to everything else. And it touched upon something more than all the movements and activists and all the people, the other people did. And I think that something pivoted a little bit also. And I think it had to do with the perseverance, not only of all the pressure of the movements and the activists, but Stella as well, and the whole family of Julian, his father and his brother, and the documentary, all these things sort of pressured the Australian government, and of course, because it's now a more progressive, anyway, social government than before. And I think this was a pivotal moment that we could imagine that maybe something could happen. Before that, I think it was impossible to even imagine that there could be any hope for Julian. And I think that this gives me hope as well, because now they have come out. So now I think, of course, it's natural we're all looking at the plane and whether the plane will land and whether they will keep their word. But I think that since the Australian government has come out very strongly now saying that it's time for him to come back, it would be very difficult. I really don't want to believe that something could go wrong. Of course, we are all keeping this because it's been so many years that we really couldn't believe that this day would come. So it's natural. And I just wanted to say that personally, what I felt, because after living in these dark times for the last year, and now with the war in Palestine, and it's been so bleak and dark that this just gave me a sense of comfort that something that good can prevail still. And this is just a personal, my personal emotion, and I believe all of us share this and many other people in the world. And it was just a very comforting moment, this little light coming through this darkness that we're all going through. That's all for me. Thank you.
Thank you, Danai. I think perseverance indeed is a very good term here. I suspect the US did not expect the campaign to free Julian to last so long as well. And I think it goes to show that, annoying the living daylights out of those in power over a long period of time can actually be a quite successful strategy to have some impact, even if it takes a lot of resources. But if it can be sustained, I think it's definitely something that can have an impact, which brings me to what I wanted to also say. Which is why engagement matters. So if you're watching out there and if you want to get engaged in a political organization such as the M25, you can go on our website, dm25.org/join, and you can be a member in 2 minutes. Now we'll go over to Evie.
Good evening by me as well. I hope you hear me well because I'm an external location. So at first place, of course, I share the same joy by listening the news that finally Julian Assange is free. But I still feel some kind of fear by the pressure they still and the control they still put on him. Till the whole case is closed and until he is safe back home, I will feel still kind of worried. The point is, the way they do it is they want to show everybody who wants to speak up that it's not what they wish. They want to shut mouths up. But even this small victory, this step ahead, has created new forces, has given power to new media be created, new whistleblowers getting courage by the whole presence, the whole story, the whole case of Assange, that at least he's not bending. It was a really good news. I hope they will last till the end, see him home free and active again.
Thank you, Evie. Thank you for that. We all wish that. Really hope to see images of that very, very soon. We'll go back to Ivana, and then Johannes hopefully can join afterwards. He's traveling, so let's see. Ivana, go ahead.
Thanks. I just wanted to shortly jump in again because to underline this strategy of smear campaigns and character associations, because it's a pattern that repeats, and it's almost as if there is a package that exists and they pull one out when somebody needs to be politically or publicly killed. So we had this as well on example of Jeremy Corbyn and his political or character association, and media is complicit. That's what is most important here. And also to have in mind that the left is mostly the one to bite this bait of character assassinations first. And that's what Julian's case also showed us, as Yanis said at the very beginning. So debunking these media campaigns is also something that we should continue doing. Thanks.
Thanks, Ivana. I don't think they're leftists, quite honestly. The true leftists, as I understand them, the people who do that. But yeah, good point. We'll try and go to Johannes now. Johannes, can you connect, or how are
Yes,
you doing?
I hope so. I'm doing well, thank you. Good news today. I will not repeat what everyone has already said. I wanted to highlight one point, which is, I think, in the days, weeks, months, years to come, we can really look back at this case as a study case for us and as a learning experience. And I want to highlight that, first of all, what hasn't been mentioning that much, I think it's crazy that we can also see now that we are celebrating that he's free, and it's great, but he has to go to that island to plead guilty, and he will not be repaid. You know, he will have to sign that all this time that he has spent in a high security prison was for a real crime that he really committed. That's what he has to sign. And all of that in the so-called Free West. And I think, and in the democratic so-called Free West. And I think for us, this should really be a wake-up call for all people in the West, especially, of course, leftist progressive forces, to understand that also here in our so-called democracies, there's realms of power if you challenge them. And one of them is, of course, the military-industrial complex, that you really, really fast experience the end of democracy for you, as Julian experienced it. And I think Karin has also been mentioning the cases that have been going on in Germany and in a lot of other countries as well, around the protests against the genocide in Gaza. And I think this is just something that we should look back at, as well as the hypocrisy of our politicians, who are always great freedom fighters for political prisoners, and often rightfully so in other states as Russia, Iran. You know, they're great freedom fighters for people there, but they're just silent on people like Julian Assange and other people that have been mentioned today. And I think we should really take this as a learning experience and learn from it, that we all have to start at home, in our democracies, in our states where we live, in our societies, to fight for the rights of free speech and free journalism there. Thank you.
Thank you, Johannes, for that. Now we'll hear from Eric before we close. Eric Edman, who's now back in Brussels. Over to you, Eric.
Hi, everybody. Thanks, David. So what I wanted to say is the following. We've been quite positive overall, but we've also at the same time really focused as the core negative this case of what do you call it, the court that Julian has to go through in the Pacific. There are two ways of looking at this, however, and I want to go back to the 17th century and remind you of what Galileo Galilei had to go through when he said that the Earth actually revolves around the sun and not the other way around. He had to go through the Inquisition in order to avoid being burnt at the stake. He had to admit that that was all false. And yet when he walked out, he said, and yet it moves. And 300 years later, here we all are, and we know what the truth is. We're not here thinking that the sun revolves around the Earth. We know that it's the opposite, regardless of what they forced, what the powers that be at the time forced Galileo to do and say. And that is another way of looking at this pathetic court that they're making Assange go through in this performative act of an admission of guilt. So we can just laugh at it as well. It's also up to us to treat it with the contempt that it deserves, that they are forced to put Julian through this last performative sort of process in order to somehow cover the torture that they've put him through for over the last decade. And instead, by continuing to fight for his rights, fight for the things that he stood for, and for the freedom of speech and the space that he allowed us to today celebrate, essentially, with his eventual with being let free, and regardless of this court case that he's being put through, we should be treating the powers that be with contempt and not with fear, because they are forced to go through this in order to save whatever little dignity they think they have left, when in fact it's making them appear even more pathetic. And just like Galileo, we will know, and people will know 100, 200, and 300 years from now what the truth was and who was on the right side of history.
Thank you, Eric. Indeed, he wasn't on the right side of history. He is on the right side of history, and you're completely right that we need to treat those, in power with contempt for what they've been trying to do, not just to Julian, but to so many others who are speaking truth to power and trying to bring real democracy to the ground, to where people live in their countries and their regions and so on. So we're reaching a closing now. Thank you so much we've reached the closing stages of our conversation here today. Thanks so much for everybody who's tuned in. Thank you so much to our panel. Thank you for your comments and your questions, and come back in 2 weeks from now at the same time, same place for another live discussion. In the meantime, take care and stay safe. Free Julian.